So, I've got something super fascinating for you today. Like, really fascinating. I've been doing some research into these incredible burial practices from Asia, and you're not going to believe this.
Oh, tell me more. You know how much I love it when you bring the weird stuff.
Well, you know how most cultures bury their dead in the ground, right? But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. There are places in Asia where they actually hung the coffins. I mean, literally hung them on the sides of cliffs.
Wait, what? How does that even work on actual cliffs?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just one random place that did this. We're talking about different cultures across China, the Philippines, and Indonesia who all developed these amazing practices of placing their dead high up on cliff faces. And you know what's really cool? Some of them are still there today.
That's incredible, and this is perfect for Lost and Found because it's definitely one of the strangest finds in history. So, where do we even start with this?
I think we should begin with China, because that's where some of the most fascinating examples are. And there's this whole mystery about an extinct civilization called the Bo people, who, well, let me tell you about them. The Bo people were this absolutely fascinating civilization in southern China. They were really successful farmers and amazing horsemen too. But here's the thing, they're completely extinct now, which makes their hanging coffin practices even more mysterious.
How did they become extinct? That sounds pretty tragic.
Yeah, it's really sad. They were basically wiped out during the Ming Dynasty in 1573. We're talking about a complete genocide here. And because of that, so much of their culture and traditions were just lost.
So how do these hanging coffins actually work?
Right? So here's how it worked. They'd take these coffins, usually carved from a single piece of wood, which is pretty impressive on its own. Then, they'd place them on these wooden beams that stuck out from the cliff face, or sometimes they'd tuck them into these natural caves in the mountains.
That must have taken so much work.
Oh my God, yes. And what's really interesting is that we actually have this tiny little description from Marco Polo, who observed some of their burial practices. He mentioned that they'd put their dead in boxes and take them up to the mountains, placing them in caves or hanging them where others couldn't reach them.
Do we know why they did this?
Well, that's the thing. We can only make educated guesses because, there are no Bo people left to tell us. But the most likely explanation is that they wanted to protect their dead from being disturbed. And there's actually this really interesting detail. There might be some survivors of the Bo people today.
Really? How's that possible?
So, there's this group called the Ku people in southern Yunnan who still practice hanging coffins, and they're believed to be descendants of the Bo. There are also people with the surname He in Yunnan who local traditions say are connected to the Bo people. But we can't know for sure, because so much time has passed and so much knowledge has been lost. So, the really fascinating thing is that these hanging coffins aren't just found in one place in China. They're actually spread out across multiple provinces and regions, and each site has its own unique story,
Where are some of the main places they've been found?
Oh my God, okay. So, first there's the Wuyi Mountains in Fujian province, right? And that's just incredible. Then, there are these amazing sites in the Three Gorges area, especially in the Kutang Gorge, which is just breathtaking, really.
What about the ones in Yunnan that you mentioned earlier?
Yes. So in Yunnan, there's this incredible site called Dushiguan where the Bo people had their hanging coffins. Then there's this other amazing location near Bainitang where the Ku people, the ones I mentioned who might be related to the Bo, have their hanging tombs.
Are they all placed in similar ways?
Well, that's what's so interesting. Some of them are placed on these wooden beams that stick out from the cliff face, right? But others are tucked into these natural caves or placed on these rock projections that jut out from the mountain. And in places like Guangxi, along the Hongshui River cliffs, you've got these coffins that were actually built by a completely different group called the Buyang people.
These locations sound really remote.
Totally. And that's probably part of the point, These weren't just random spots. The people who created these burial sites specifically chose these hard-to-reach places. What's really mind-blowing is that each location kind of tells its own story about the different cultures and peoples who lived in these regions.
So tell me about the hanging coffins in the Philippines. Are they similar to the ones in China?
Oh my God. Okay, so these are actually super fascinating because they're still part of a living tradition, right? They're found in this place called Sagada in Mountain Province, and they belong to the Kankanay people, and they're believed to be centuries old.
How do they actually place the coffins?
So the really interesting thing is that they put them under these natural overhangs, right? Sometimes they're just placed on natural rock shelves, but other times they use wooden beams that slot into holes in the cliff. The coolest part? The coffins are actually really small because, get this, they put the bodies in a fetal position.
That's such a specific way to position them. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, it's this really beautiful belief they have. that people should leave the world in the same position they entered it, you know? And here's something really fascinating. People actually carve their own coffins during their lifetime.
Wait, everyone gets a hanging coffin?
Oh, no. That's what makes this so special. The hanging coffins are really exclusive. They're only for distinguished community leaders who've done something remarkable. Like, they need to have made wise decisions, led important rituals, really contributed to the community.
So the placement must be pretty significant then.
Exactly. And the really fascinating thing is that the height where they place the coffin actually shows the person's social status. Most of the people who get hanging coffins are these super important members of what they call the Amam-A, which is like this council of male elders. Though, fun fact, there's actually one recorded case of a woman getting a hanging coffin.
What about everyone else? How are they buried?
So, the more common practice is to place the coffins in these limestone caves, right? They're either tucked into crevices or stacked on top of each other. But even then, the location depends on the person's status and even how they died. And before any burial, they have to do these specific rituals called sangadil.
What's the thinking behind all of this?
The Kankanaey people believe that by burying their dead in these cliffs and caves, their spirits, they call them anito, can roam around and keep protecting the living. And you know what's really interesting? These hanging coffins in Echo Valley have actually become a huge tourist attraction now.
So, what about Indonesia? Do they have hanging coffins there too?
Oh yeah, and they're absolutely fascinating. The Toraja people in Sulawesi have this incredible tradition called liang tokek, which literally means hanging burial, and they do some really unique things with it.
What makes them different from the others we've talked about?
So, the really cool thing about these is that they have these super distinctive boat-shaped coffins, right? They call them erong, and they always place them under these overhanging parts of cliffs. Sometimes they use natural overhangs or cave openings, but get this, sometimes they actually create artificial overhangs just for the coffins.
That's so much work. There must be something special about them?
Oh, totally. And here's the really fascinating part. They have these wooden guardians called tau that watch over the coffins. They're carved representations of the deceased. And what's super interesting is that the older tau are more abstract, but the newer ones, they can be incredibly lifelike.
Is there a reason they put them up so high?
Yeah, it's actually really practical. They wanted to discourage looters from stealing the items buried with the dead. But you know what's really interesting? These hanging coffins were super exclusive. They were only for the village founders, and some of them date all the way back to around 780 AD.
That's incredible. Is this still their main burial practice?
Oh no. Similar to what we saw in the Philippines, it was actually just one part of this really complex burial system. They had all these different types of burials depending on social class and age. And they had these other fascinating methods like liang silik and liang erong for cave burials, and these really cool house-shaped tombs called tangdan for noblemen that they'd place on hilltops.
What's the significance of all these different burial places?
So, the Torajan people believe that these burial complexes are like actual homes for the spirits in the afterlife, you know? And each different type of burial has its own special meaning and purpose in their culture. It's just such an intricate and thoughtful way of honoring their dead.
So, when we look at all these different hanging coffin traditions, what really stands out to you?
You know what's really fascinating? And this just blows my mind? All these different cultures, totally separated by oceans and mountains, came up with the same idea of placing their dead up high, right? But here's the cool part. They each did it in their own unique way.
How different are they from each other?
So in China, it's this whole mystery with the Bo people, right? Then in the Philippines, it's all about social status and honoring community leaders. But in Indonesia, they've got these amazing boat-shaped coffins with their wooden guardians. They're all connected, but totally different at the same time.
Can people actually visit these sites today?
Oh, absolutely. The hanging coffins in Sagada, Philippines have become a really popular tourist destination in Echo Valley. And in China, there are several sites you can visit, especially in the Wuyi Mountains. But here's the thing. We have to remember that these aren't just tourist attractions, right? They're sacred burial grounds that deserve our full respect.
It's amazing that they've survived all this time.
Right? And that's what makes them so special. They're not just ancient burial practices. They're snapshots of human ingenuity and spiritual beliefs that have lasted for centuries. And they're still teaching us things about these fascinating cultures today.
It's incredible to think about how these traditions have endured for so long. Each one tells a story, not just about how people honored their dead, but about the deep connections they had to their land, their beliefs, and their communities.
Exactly. And that's why these sites are so much more than just historical landmarks. They're windows into the past that still have so much to teach us.
And that's all the time we have for this episode of Lost and Found. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of hanging coffins.
We'll be back next time with another unbelievable discovery, so don't forget to follow us and stay tuned. See you next time on Lost and Found.